Hello, YouTube. It's Gilbert again from the Unnamed Game Company. Welcome to episode 2 of our designer podcast. I said that we do an episode in the future about the corruption system. Yes, corruption was our second, third, and fourth release. It was the job first, then corruption, then vigilante. I'm gonna talk about what sort of created the system, how the system was sort of put together. Went through a number of playtests. I playtested this at Big Bad Con. I playtested this at a few local meetups. It was my first game. It was only supposed to be a 2-page game, and it turned out to be a 2-page game. But when it gets relayed out, it's actually more like a 3 or 4-page game. That's how Caradwin laid it out. But corruption is my first game, and I was super excited just to release something. I always thought that I didn't really want to start off in the game that really got me into design, which is a game called Generations. I really wanted to release something smaller, so I just get my feet wet on things. But yeah, the starting point. This was the starting point for 6-5 Studios before I joined up with, before we formed up an Unnamed Game Company. And corruption is basically, the notion of corruption is there is this criminal conspiracy. The idea behind it is that there is somebody in a seat of power who is one of the supposed good guys, and there's somebody in the seat of, bad guys, the criminal organizations, the mob or whatever it is, and they are colluding in some way to perpetrate some sort of big grand scheme. It takes the sort of easy roll decider things that the fast starts that you can find in games like Honey Heist, that you can find in Lasers and Feelings. We wanted to have that feel in the GM's guide where you could just sort of do this roll table, pick your villains, start the game. Initially, when we first came out of the game, I was really okay, let's try to make this as realistic as possible. Let's really try to, I put a whole how do you create phrases and police procedurals, and how does investigations work, and I mean really overthought it, and I was really and this is something that sort of has been knocked out of me as I've done the 31 days of games, which is a sense of really trying to think as a player in the more fundamental notion, and then just as a part of me that's been trying to put too much emphasis on making as realistic as possible, when in reality there's a suspension of disbelief that we have to play in order for us to do TTRPG. We don't really have to consider physics when we're playing our barbarian. It is what it is. It is a game, so trying to overcomplicate games is difficult. So we started off with corruption. I started off with corruption with this notion of grand scheme, very Wire feel. There's a sense of The Wire. If you like The Wire, this is a game that might be suited for you. It's a sense of this grand investigation, this sense of we're going to have to gather evidence, we're going to have to try to figure things out, we're going to have to find out who's with who and what's with what. And it's really one of those games where and when we initially designed the game, it was supposed to be here is this floating dice pool, and you're knocking the dice pool down through investigation. And for me, it felt clunky, and I always felt like it was a bit of a clunky thing. I had to pause there for a second. Sorry. There was an ambulance passing through. Like I said, I live on a busy street. I think I told you guys that the last episode. I live on a busy street, so all sorts of vehicles and sounds and passerbys will just be heard, and I don't know how to fix that. I am not good with the technology. Besides the point, so we really want to create this sort of grand investigation. Didn't want to bog down with like things like trying to get jurisdiction or other things. So we try to like find a way around it by saying like, okay, this is a state investigation, and you have carte blanche maneuverability around the city. It's a task force, so you don't really have to answer to any of the precincts. Okay, cool, that makes sense. Let's just go with that, and so it became this. It's sort of the feel. Like I design with the sense of like, here's a feel I want. How do I make this feel happen? And how do I make this feel happen through mechanic, not necessarily through world building? Because I think you can make fiction fit a narrative, but there's a lot of times where like, if you look at a game, you just go like, hey, the mechanics don't necessarily, the game component of it doesn't necessarily match the fiction of the world. And I think that there are two types of designers. There are designers who say, okay, I'm going to create this fiction. I want to be they're more fiction writer designers. And then there are the designers who are like game designer writers, which is like, I am creating a game, in which dice mechanics, movement through space, the gamey stuff means something. And I'm not saying that designers don't do that stuff, but I think that there's a sense of like the mechanic is secondary to some designers, because whenever you hear a pitch from a designer, it's always like, okay, here's the idea. It's about this world, and it's about in the future, and it's like it's always very fiction focused, like spiel. It's a very fiction focused pitch. Like it's here. This is the world that I want to create, and people are like, oh, that's really fascinating. I'd love to play in that world. But it's like a lot of times the world is the foremost thought process in the design construct, not the game mechanic. And so for me, I don't really look at the world because like that is a GM construct. How a GM is going to run a game that's the atmosphere, and that's the construct of the GM and the players are going to make. I can't control what happens after the game is released, but what I can control is game mechanic, because a game mechanic are the fundamental rules that we have to live by as players and as GMs. Like we can change those rules, but there's you can't take away the D20 from Dungeons and Dragons. You just can't. You just, oh, we're gonna start using a D12. That's not gonna work. It is ingrained into the system that a D20 must exist in the D20 system. That's the way it is. And so I can control game mechanic. I necessarily can't control fiction. I can't control atmosphere. So I'm very focused on like, how does the mechanic of the game reflect the feel of the game? Because if I can't create that, then I feel I fail as a designer. So everything is very purposeful in the game, in the mechanic construct of how I design. Like everything is about the game rulings. And I know a lot of people are like, that's the non-important part. That's the stuff we throw apart. It's the reason we call it a game is because there's fundamental rules in which we all agree to abide by, that we share, so that we can play fairly amongst ourselves. Whether we lose or whether we win or whether there's dice, there is the fundamental aspect underneath everything is that it is a game. And under the game, there's rules. And in those rules, we just sort of agree as a table and as people to play by those rules. And I can go into a whole set of things about like, what is design and all this other stuff, and I will eventually get to like design theory and like what I think about how design is, and critiques of their industry, critiques of other, not really specific designers, but thought processes in design. Because there's but yeah, there's a very like, we are focused on fiction, and I am not focused on fiction. So it's very important to understand that when I'm talking about stuff, it is, the thought process was very purposeful as to how to make corruption feel like it's a big investigation game. It's also how was I intending to try to make The Job feel that way and Vigilante feel that way. And each of those games actually has very specific differences from how corruption plays. So it's not that I just took corruption, copy pasted, and moved it over. It's very clear that that's not what happened. Each one is distinguishably its own game, and I think it's something I want to like reiterate, because if you play The Job, it's not going to be anything like corruption, and if you play Vigilante, it's not going to be anything like any of those. It's very much its own thing, and there's this specific feels that I really was aiming for when I was creating these games. So corruption, I was really trying to do that sense of like, okay, this is the grand investigation. You're gonna have to gather clues, and gathering clues gains you. So initially, in this world, every time you roll a 6, you can take it out of the pool and put it into a final die roll pool. And this is what you want to be doing early on. You really want to be like diminishing your pool every chance you get to try to build this final die pool, because at the very end it's going to be a roll-off between you and the villains. And how you roll is very determinant on how, whether you succeed or not. And so as this game progresses, you'll roll dice, you'll do investigations, you'll beat down bad guys, you'll search for evidence, you'll do things, and every time you get a 6, you can either opt to take the 6 out of there. You can take 1 6 per roll, and you can put it into a final die pool. And depending on your difficulty sense, what you wanted for difficulty, you'll have to roll that against this sort of 2 final villains. One is is like the mayor of the city, and the other is like the head of the the mafia, or whatever it is. I was gonna say Italian mafia, but I don't think I put Italian mafia in there. But it's sort of like the mafia is working with the mayor to do something, and you're trying to find out through these investigations who the players are, what people are doing, and it's sort of very collaborative storytelling. But the dice component system was very important to me, how I thought of it, because it's a joint dice pool, first of all. So you start the game with 2 d6s per individual player. So if you have 3 players, it's 6 dice. If you have 4 players, it's 8 dice, which is great. It's nice. So you start with a corruption score of 1, and every time you roll, you create a dice pool. And every time you roll above your score, it's a success. Every time you roll at your score, it's a failure, and you lose the dice. So at the very beginning of the game, this is super easy. You're able to do all sorts of things because you're coming out of the gate strong. You're rolling, you're smashing through doors, you're finding people, because the investigation is easy. And then you start to lose dice. And the fun part of this is there's going to be players that are going to be conservative, and they're going to roll, I'm going to roll like 1 die, or I'm going to roll a few dice. I'm going to roll the minimum die. And then there's going to be players who are going to be like willy-nilly about it, who are going to roll big dice. And the fun part of this game is that the tension of dice choice is complicated, because it doesn't matter how many times you make deals with the GM, it's still a shared dice pool. So you have your like specialty die, and then you have your dice, and then you have the group dice pool. So whenever you play this game, you can decide however many dice you want to roll. And so you could have a terrible roll that burns out all of the dice in one single go, and the GM could be very evil about it and offer almost nothing. And if you can't make a deal with the devil, then game over. It's just the way that it is. If nobody wants to like budge, then the game just ends and you can't succeed. So as your dice pool diminishes, it really has this deal with the devil. And it's the sense of like the GM has carte blanche. GM can say, oh, I'm going to give you 4 dice. And you have to have, and anytime you do increase corruption scores and corruption, you are in essence corrupting your soul. So you have to do something that isn't a good guy move. You have to like tamper with evidence. You have to do something that just, infringes upon the goodness of your soul. And then as you do that, you've now moved up to corruption score 2. So every time you roll at or below your score, it's now fundamentally harder. So you're balancing this game of like, I need dice to play, but every time I get dice, I also hurt myself. And this sort of fundamental ruling is intended to make the game harder as you progress. Because even if you got every single one of your die in the beginning of the game into the final dice pool, it's only 8 dice. And at that stage, everyone could renegotiate, and now you're at level 2. And the GM could just be like, I'll give each of you 1 die. I'll give each of you like nothing for a score 2. So it's really, if you have a very vindictive GM or you have a very nice GM, corruption can be a very tense game. And so that's sort of the purpose point of like, as you progress in the game and you get more corrupt, the game becomes that much more difficult for you. But in order for you to progress through the game, you need to be corrupt. You need to be able to toe the line. You need to cross the line, or if you don't, then you never succeed. So, it's this very strong balancing act, and you get to the final pool, and you roll off against the villains, and every player has to roll off against the villains. So, like your corrupt 5 guy you don't want them to burn down their dice. So like it becomes a battle of who's going to run out of dice first. And a villain has a score of 6, and they have to roll below their score, while you have to roll above your score. So if you're all 4s and 5 corruptions, you have a 1 in 6 chance against the villain. And at the very end, whoever has the most successes between you and the villain wins the game. And each of the villains can be arrested separately, but so they all have their own separate dice pool. So you could get one, but not the other. And it's this is a very muddled mess of how things will play out. And I think that's a really fascinating way of looking at corruption. Vigilante is different in that, yes, you are the good guys, but you're doing it in a very we don't care attitude. And so there is 2 different components in Vigilante that are not in corruption. There is safe houses, there's safe havens, because you're ordinary people. So the feel is you really want to give that sort of like, we're good guys and we're fighting bad guys. So the world around us is far more exposed. You have to really consider that, like, as the game progresses, your sort of like safe havens become compromised, and they could be destroyed. So you fly too close to the darkness, the worlds around you start to get hurt too. So it's we really want to recreate the feels of like Kick-Ass, or what is the name of that movie? John Wick, Kick-Ass. This is a sort of like, not really more so John Wick, but more of we're ordinary people trying to go do something, and but then the more you fight crime, the more you're you're sort of compromising your body, and you're sort of compromising the safe havens that you have. So that burger shop that you all sit at gets torched, or the dormitory gets attacked by the villains, and so it's that sense of like the middle of the movie part where everybody's like, oh, we're winning the battle, but you failed way too many times and you've rolled too many low scores. So the GM is compromising your hideouts and your safe zones, and that's really terrible for you. So it's intended to feel like it's a big battle, like you have to conquer 3 locations. So this is not a final roll off like you do with corruption. You actually progressively have to take down 3 different locations. You take down the first, you take down the second, and then you sort of take down the final boss of the syndicate in the high rise or wherever it is. And you can also, this is the one game where you can die. You can't that doesn't happen in corruption, and it doesn't happen in the job, but it does happen in Vigilante, where your character could die. And we really like the notion of like injuries, because there's so many of these Vigilante movies where somebody has like, I have a broken arm, and it's just like, I will keep shooting. Does it affect your arm? No, it doesn't. I mean, if you look at like Die Hard, McClane has like glass on his feet, and yet he's able to, and he like stumbles around the whole time. It's great. It's just that notion of like, so every failure, every sense of failures you get, you're compromising your body, you're breaking yourself down. Every sense of failures you get, you also compromise the people around you, and every time you make a deal, your villain score goes up. So you become the thing that you're fighting against. And so this is another one of those like corruption is fighting against, you're staring into the darkness and you're trying to fight back. And in Vigilante, you're fighting these villains. You're literally fighting these villains, and you are becoming one yourself. It is that whole like Batman appeal. Like Batman is crossing the line, and when Batman crossed the line, it's like, oh gosh, this is bad. Like this has gone to the point. And it's that notion that like what do you do to seek revenge? What do you do to seek to quench your thirst of hatred, or to get back at these people? And are you willing to go there? I mean, yes, there's a notion that some of the players will, because it's a group dice pool, there's a thought process that some players will sacrifice themselves to get dice for the final dice pool, to get more dice to the other players, and not final dice pool, but to get dice to the other players. And it's that process that some people are like, I'm doing this for the greater good, which only inevitably gets them to the point where they're like a villain 5 or a corruption 5. They end up becoming the thing that the other players are fighting against. They want to, like, especially this is true in the job. This is very much true in the job. If you play the job, you're playing your score is a trader score. So every time you increase your trader score, you're doing something that goes against the group, and that could be like removing dice from the board, or that could be like talking to the villain, revealing secrets. And that is problematic onto its own self. But it's this notion that like, I'm putting dice back into the final pool, but at the same time, you very well could be the reason that they lose the game. So it's a sneaky system. Like, if you play the corruption system, it's very sneaky. I like it personally. It's one of my favorites. I'm biased though, but sorry, there's so many us, but another one. My point being is that corruption and Vigilante and the job are these 3 sort of different systems, but they have sort of the goal and the purpose, which is it's always easy at the beginning. It's always fun and joyful, but the game inherently is built in to create rampant tension amongst yourself, with your own character, within your own self as a player, and to create tension amongst the group. and that's the tension is created through player-to-player interaction, because I think there's this thought process, like, it's not just like the game also can incite tension between players, not just the characters. And it's not a bad thing to create tension between players, as long as it's like it's not a purposeful hatred tension. But this tension is like, there's going to be players who are going to play fast and loose. When you're playing a share game where like your dice pool is finite, then you're thinking to yourself like, oh, if I use 7 dice now, I can succeed at this, but if I fail this dice roll, I lose so many dice. And there's players in the room who are like, oh no, don't do that. And then there's the players who will like increase their corruption score and say to themselves, maybe I shouldn't do any actions, but GMs are not going to let you do that. That's not, oh, I'm just going to go sit in the office now. Nope, you're going to go out there and play. And that adds so many tricky circumstances, because you can't just become a wallflower while other people play. So it becomes a game where like you're becoming your own worst enemy. It's not really the GM's there to facilitate. It's really the players who are doing this to themselves. This is really like their tactical strategy of like, I'm going to do this and it's going to screw everybody up. And that's why we created Corruption, because it's I am my own worst enemy game. It's not very the very end, when you look at these movies, when you really look at like a vigilante movie, when you really look at like a grand investigation movie, or when you look at like a heist movie, the thing that undoes them is never the villain necessarily. It's always the group itself. It's always like in the grand investigation game, it's somebody in there that just decides that I'm just gonna become corrupt. I'm gonna, like, if you ever watched the movie SWAT, I think it's SWAT with Colin Farrell. Yeah. It's a game about like they're this special SWAT team and they're gonna do these things, and of course there's a betrayal, and that's because the character becomes corrupt. He's so corrupted that he turns against his own group before the final villain can be caught. In heist movies, it's always somebody's traitor score that gets so high that they turn on the entire group. In vigilantes, it's always somebody gets too heated, gets too overzealous, and wants to destroy and kill or take it too far, or break the sense of like, this is what we're, the purpose of it, and they just become the bad guy themselves. It is never it's sometimes the undoing of the bad guy, but the best movies are always when it's the group that creates the dynamic of destruction, not necessarily the game itself, the villain itself. Because the villains are like, oh, we get shot so easily, but when the group is destroying themselves, it's far more interesting as a game. And this is what we created with Corruption. A sneaky initially a two-page game that has now, that if you get to play it, you get to see that it is, it's twisted. It is a very twisted game. Okay, that's the end of my second episode here, everybody. Thank you for listening. Next week, I will go into the next episode, not next week. Well, probably will be the next week when we get to it. But we will likely go over Murders and Mayhems. I will talk about sort of horror genre as a whole, where we came from with Murders and Mayhems. If you don't know what Murders and Mayhems is, one of our 31 days of games. We talk about in Murders and Mayhems. When we talk about Murders and Mayhems, it's a Shoots and Ladders horror game. So if you played Shoots and Ladders, you'd like, I think you'd like Murders and Mayhems. It's kind of got that dread feel. It's kind of got that board game like tension wrapper. It was initially inspired because of a discussion between myself and Kalen Hale. So I think that'll be what we'll discuss next time. It's actually available right now. It was released last Saturday on the 22nd, so if that's something that you're interested in, you can check it out in the links below. if you like this podcast and you want to see more of it, please hit like and subscribe, and have a good day.